Welcome to the Wholehearted Wellness Podcast. As a friendly reminder, the Wholehearted Wellness Podcast is not a substitute to receiving mental and physical support from a licensed wellness provider. We encourage you to speak with your wellness provider prior to trying any therapeutic modalities mentioned on this podcast. Welcome back, everyone. I am so excited to have a good friend of mine, Elizabeth, here today. She is a registered dietitian, and a few months back, I actually had her come and meet our team and share a little bit about what she does. And one of her areas of expertise is working with people to build a better relationship with food and their body through intuitive eating, which is a really, really neat concept. And I'll tell y'all, I'm equally excited to be sharing this with y'all as well as to be learning from her today, because I know that's an area I can continue growing in. So, Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to talk about intuitive eating. It's something I can talk about for days on end.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yes.
Sure. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about you and what brought you into this profession.
Yeah, so I would say I started getting interested in nutrition and fitness back in high school. That's usually when young girls are kind of exposed to those types of things. So that's when nutrition started to become more of an interest of mine, and I decided kind of early on in my high school career that I wanted to become a dietitian eventually. So I went through the schooling. So I went to LSU for undergrad education, and then went on to get my master's and do my dietetic internship and all of that. But I actually have kind of fallen into intuitive eating specifically, kind of from my own personal struggles with eating and body image and all of that. I really struggled with all of that on my own, and eventually after graduating from undergrad, I discovered the concept of intuitive eating, and I learned all about it immediately. I read the book in 2 days, and so I really just immersed myself in it, and I could not believe how life-changing it was.
Sure.
And so once I was getting towards the end of my education and all of that, I started to realize that that was really the focus that I wanted to have in my practice. I knew I wanted to have a private practice eventually, which I ended up creating back in May of last year. So that's my focus area. But I just believe that it's so life-changing, and really it's interesting because we're all born intuitive eaters, and then diet culture kind of comes into play. And so we're influenced by all of these diets and trends and fads that come and go. But it's so interesting to know that we're born intuitive eaters, and coming back to it later on in life is an incredible feeling. And that's what I want for all my clients and really anyone. It's really our body's natural desire as far as nutrition goes.
Sure. I can imagine it's very empowering, where it's you listening to your body and what it needs and letting it, I know it's kind of a rough word, control, but rather than the diet control you.
Yes.
You know?
Yes. Diets can be very rigid, which is why they don't really work. And I mean, I think most people have been on at least one diet in their life. So I really think anyone can benefit from, learning about intuitive eating and kind of undoing that damage that diets do. And a lot of times it's not just the diet and nutrition, but a lot of times body image comes into play, especially depending on how, deep-rooted all of that really gets a hold of you.
Yeah. Absolutely. So tell us about what intuitive eating is.
Yeah. So intuitive eating is pretty much a non-diet approach to nutrition. So it's a whole framework. It was developed by two dietitians probably around 40-ish years ago, I want to say. And there's 10 principles of intuitive eating, and that's, laid out in the framework. And there's a book, like I said earlier, I like read the whole book in 2 days. But those two dietitians who like kind of laid out the framework for it wrote the book. And it's in its fourth edition, if anyone's interested in picking up a copy. But essentially, the main components of it, I would say, is really just getting back to that place, like I said, like we're all born intuitive eaters, like coming back to a place where you can honor and recognize both your hunger and your fullness cues. Also, there's a lot of body image work that comes into play because that's kind of the whole reason people go on diets is, to change their bodies in some capacity. So there's a lot of undoing in that realm as well. But honoring hunger cues, fullness cues, coming back to a place where, like you mentioned, like listening to your body and what it needs and like finding what feels good to you. And that can seem like a very daunting thing if you're listening to this and you're like, I have no idea what my body wants. I just do, what I think I should do or what, society tells me I should do. But it is definitely possible to get to that place where you are an intuitive eater. And I would say it's a lot easier to get to that place when you have support and work with a professional. I think that definitely can expedite the process. But yeah, coming to a place where you're able to like really just honor your body and like its needs in the sense of both nutrition and also joyful movement. Like a lot of times,
love that.
yeah, a lot of people are, struggling with exercise routines and how to stay consistent with things. But a lot of times it is because, you don't enjoy what you're doing. Again, you're like letting society tell you what it is that you should be doing. And so you do that, but you don't enjoy it. So it's like you're dreading it. And then, if you miss a few workouts, then you just fall off the bandwagon completely. Then you're not doing anything. But I really love working with clients specifically on joyful movement and like helping them find movement that they actually enjoy, that they can be consistent with. And in the long term, like that's what it's all about is like being consistent, like fueling yourself consistently throughout the day and exercising consistently on a consistent basis because otherwise it's like the benefits just aren't going to be there.
Sure. Yeah. How do you work or what do you recommend with clients that gosh, because I know I can personally be this way. Maybe you have a health condition that you need a certain type of protocol, whether it's lower carb or, man, you can't eat dairy, you can't eat gluten. But you also want to practice intuitive eating, but maybe you crave these things, right? So how do you find the balance between those two?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting question. And I get it a lot. It is totally possible to be an intuitive eater and also manage your chronic illnesses and other, health conditions. I have a lot of clients that have diabetes or insulin sensitivity or other, like heart issues. All of that is, largely genetic, but obviously is very impacted by nutrition. But you can absolutely become an intuitive eater and manage all of that. And actually, a lot of what I work on with clients is kind of all encompassing in that capacity. Like, especially if we're talking about insulin sensitivity, like eating consistently throughout the day is like one of the main recommendations as far as managing your blood sugars. Like if you're going long periods without eating, you're going to experience significant highs and lows in terms of your blood sugar spiking and dropping and all of that. So a lot of what intuitive eating is all about really does aid and help in managing all of those symptoms. And one thing with intuitive eating, kind of the last piece that I would say is recommended to work on with clients would be the gentle nutrition piece. So really, whenever a client is struggling with their relationship with food, kind of the first step, like first of all, is like working on healing that relationship with food and body. And then once we've kind of worked on that and we're in a good place, then we kind of work on the gentle nutrition side of things. So like, how do we balance our plate? How do we, we have to have a plan for fueling ourselves consistently throughout the day. Like, what is your day like? Like, how can we make sure that we're getting you adequate fuel? All of that comes in a little bit later, depending on where the client is or where this person is. But absolutely back to your question about, managing disease and certain protocols. it does get a little tricky, when there are any types of restrictions, obviously. But it's totally doable. I do have actually a client who recently found out that she is sensitive to gluten. Like, I don't think she necessarily has a celiac diagnosis, but it's more so that she's very sensitive to it. She has other autoimmune issues going on right now. And she basically eliminated gluten for about a month and found that whenever she reintroduced it, she had some pretty significant GI issues. And that was we kind of nailed that down. But she's still like balancing her plate. Like we're figuring out how to find things to swap out, instead of having those things. So it does take more effort whenever there is any type of, restriction with the diet. But I think that, an important thing is like having the least amount of restriction as possible. So
Sure.
working with clients, if they do have gluten sensitivities, like making sure we're not restricting any other items or food pieces that it may not be necessary to restrict, like, because whenever we restrict our body in any capacity, it's likely that we're just going to want that thing more. And it's a mental thing as well. Like, I'm sure you know better than I do. Like, whenever there's that piece of restriction, it's like, it's just like you're biologically just like wanting that even more.
Sure.
And then there's also like, if we're restricting our total energy intake for the day, obviously our body's going to try to preserve itself. So, and so that's all, diet culture, that's where all of that ties in, is like, okay, how do we figure out how to fuel you? Because
Sure.
every individual is so different. And I think that a huge negative thing, there's lots of negative things, but one huge negative with diets in general is just that it's not individualized, and every individual person has different needs, different preferences, and obviously, like we mentioned, chronic diseases to manage, other health issues. So diets is just not going to fix it. It's not going to cut it for most people.
Sure.
So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
So I think you said intuitive eating has 10 principles.
Yes.
I know I'm totally putting you on the spot right now. Do you know what those are? Do you feel comfortable sharing about them?
Yeah. I don't know if I can list them all perfectly, and definitely not in order.
Yeah, that's totally fine.
Maybe I can mention, like, I guess the more significant ones, or
Yeah.
maybe the ones that are like very pertinent to today. So one of the principles, let me actually make sure I'm like saying them correctly. All the concepts are there, but I don't want it to vibrate. So one that we've already kind of been discussing this entire time is the first principle, which is rejecting the diet mentality. And that, I think that's like one of the principles that does come in like earlier on in your intuitive eating journey, because you have to come to a point where you are like mentally trying to block out diet culture and like flat out rejecting it, because if we like hold on to any of those rules or components of those diets, then becoming an intuitive eater is very difficult.
Sure.
If we have that lingering like diet culture-y stuff going on in our heads. So
What would you say is a diet culture or diet mentality? How and people can discern what that is?
yeah, so there's a lot we could talk about, but I think that some common red flags that would suggest that maybe, you're struggling with, diet mentality, or maybe you've been dieting your whole life and maybe you don't realize that these things are going on, but maybe you are like stressing about your food choices. Like, maybe, let's say, someone wants to go out to eat with you. If initially your first thought is, oh my gosh, I need to like look up the menu, make sure I can eat something, if that's like your first response when something like that happens, I'd say that's kind of a red flag. Another thing would be constantly thinking about the next meal. So if you're like constantly thinking about food or your next meal, your next snack, that's obviously a sign that you're kind of obsessing, and like honestly, you might be like not eating enough. So your body's like constantly trying to remind you to eat. So that's another red flag. If you're, like I kind of mentioned earlier, like if you're restricting any types of food or like food groups for reasons that, aren't medically necessary, or you're not intolerant to it or you're not allergic to it, if you're restricting types of food or food in general, like total food intake, that is definitely a red flag to look out for.
Yeah, I think I've heard people say, even if you're just saying, oh, this food is bad, like labeling it as bad and good rather than it's just food. And I know
Yes.
for me and dairy are not friends. I swell up with a ton of eczema. But
Yeah.
instead of saying dairy is bad, maybe my body just doesn't like dairy. But
Yes.
not labeling it as a bad thing. It
Yes.
seems to be in diet culture and labeling good and bad foods.
Yes. And that's a really good thing to bring up whenever we're labeling foods as good versus bad, or maybe, maybe you're saying, oh, I should eat this, or I shouldn't eat that, or I, should be doing this exercise, or I shouldn't be doing this, XYZ. All of those like very extreme labels are definitely a sign that, you've kind of had diet culture ingrained in you. And something that I work on with clients is getting to a place where you can be neutral with food and your body and exercise. Like it's all neutral. It doesn't have to be this extreme thing. Like
Sure.
food is food, and some foods offer more nutrients than others, and that's just like that's it. That's all it has to be. It doesn't have to be that this food is inherently bad, because whenever we start labeling things as good or bad, morality comes into play with that. And so if you eat something that in your mind is quote unquote bad, then you think of yourself as bad and
Guilt
not
comes
worthy,
in.
guilt, shame. And
Yep.
we have to eat food. So whenever guilt and shame comes into your relationship with food, that's not ideal. And so
Sure.
that's the whole reason for intuitive eating, is like coming to a place where food is food and it nourishes you and it gives you energy and it lets you live life. But it doesn't have to be more than that. It doesn't have to be so stressful.
How do you think intuitive eating plays in with? We live in such a really unique time where we have so much processed things. Even just like junk food. I know, and I know you're probably like, don't use the word junk food, but I'm thinking like Skittles and Cheetos. That
Yeah.
clearly have no nutrition value, and I love them. I love anything that's spicy and sour. But I know that. How would you recommend people to utilize intuitive eating with processed foods that are honestly built to be addictive, right?
Yeah. So that's a huge one. And I think that a huge misconception with intuitive eating is that it's, anti-health. A lot of people think that, or maybe they, come across intuitive eating briefly, maybe it's via social media, or maybe it's, a blog post they read or whatever it is. They take what is said about intuitive eating, and maybe they do read through the principles. If you're just looking at the surface of intuitive eating and what it is, like I said, some people may take it as being anti-health. But I
Kind
would
of taking it to
say
another extreme.
yes.
Just like how some diets can be extreme.
Right,
They think,
yes.
oh, well, this is the counteract part of it. Sure.
Yes. So intuitive eating isn't necessarily saying like eat everything that you love all of the time, blah blah blah. It's much more complex than that. But as far as processed food goes, firstly, I would say that pretty much everything we see at the grocery store is processed to some extent. So that's a slippery slope in and of itself. I think that diet culture is definitely telling us like, oh, don't eat any processed food, but also like processed food is all food. Even your produce at the grocery store, like it's processed to some extent. It has to be washed. It has to be whatever, depending on what it is, it might be packaged or maybe it's pre-chopped or whatever. So processed is a very like broad term. So
Sure.
there's that whole issue. But in terms of like what you mentioned, like Cheetos, Skittles, things that are often deemed as like quote unquote junk food, as far as what intuitive eating might tell you to do is it's about allowing yourself things that you might previously have deemed, quote unquote junk food. And you might find like in the beginning of your intuitive eating journey, you're eating those things pretty frequently, right? Like because maybe you've been restricting them for a long time and
Sure.
maybe you've been telling yourself for a long time that you shouldn't have those things. But that's kind of the first step is like kind of reintroducing that food into your life and allowing it in everything, and like allowing pretty much freedom to eat it whenever you would like. That's kind of like a first step that you would take if you have been restricting and if you have been struggling with that.
Because I can imagine once that comes in, then you're not going to feel like you want it as much.
Right. Yes. That's the whole thing. Like kind of, it's like exposure therapy almost.
Sure.
Like after you've exposed yourself to it and you've like kind of almost like formed a relationship with that thing that, was in the past, like an off limits, very guilt ridden thing. Once you've re-exposed yourself to that, you're able to come to a place of like basically moderation. Like your body,
It's going to come intuitively.
yes, our bodies are so smart. Our bodies are not just going to crave Skittles and Cheetos. Like you can eat that maybe for a day, like you're only eating Cheetos and Skittles for a day, let's say. Your body is probably not going to want that the next day.
Sure.
If you think about it, just imagine yourself in that scenario. You're probably going to want like a big salad with like some protein.
Sure.
Because our bodies are so smart. It's always going to come back to a place of
letting you know what it needs.
Yes, it's going to let you know what it needs in terms of nutrition. So, like I said, it's kind of a slippery slope as far as like processed foods go, and like how do we introduce these foods that maybe in the past have elicited shame, in our lives when we eat it. But yeah, you said it perfectly. Like our body will come to a place where it knows what it needs and it will tell you. Now, obviously the journey to get back to that place where you can like trust your body enough to do that and like to expose yourself to that, it's a journey. Like it's a journey.
Sure.
But like I said, having, mental health therapists in your life, having a dietitian who specializes in these things can be so helpful in your journey and healing process.
I can imagine too, especially for women, it can be difficult. I think about just us with hormones. Gosh, like, without being TMI, but this is just science. There's going to be certain times of the month that I am starving at all times.
Yes.
And then other times that I'm not as hungry.
Yes.
I was thinking about it last night where I love Bonza mac and cheese, and I think they've got some really, really good things going on. And I was like, you know what? I'm craving this. I'm going to make it. Girl, I didn't eat that whole box of mac and cheese. And I was like, wow, I am really, really hungry. And I thought, well, this makes sense where I am in my time of month. But I think it can be even really hard for women with just fluctuating of weight and fluctuation of cravings and what they're hungry for, how much they're maybe hungry for throughout the month. So with that in mind, what do you often say to your clients that may fear when they're really hungry a lot or fear gaining weight?
Yeah. So yes, women definitely have some extra hurdles to get through in terms of, really just navigating diet culture and like,
Expectations of a body.
Yes.
Sure.
Definitely expectations of body. It's all very high for us as women. And I would say, to if I was talking to a client who was maybe struggling with, that time of month and like maybe, their cravings or like their something I like to talk about with clients actually is the different types of hunger. So there's something called taste hunger, which is very much like similar to like what you would refer to as a craving. Sometimes you just have a taste for something and you want it. And, obviously there could be underlying reasons for it, but all types of hunger, whether it's physical or like we were talking about taste hunger, like whether it's physical hunger, taste hunger, both of those types of hungers are valid and like worthy of being honored if possible. So like that's one thing, cravings, taste hunger. that's something that's totally normal for us to experience. And especially, like you said, as women, like who go through such emotional highs and lows in terms of hormone changes and everything at certain times of the month. So the taste hunger and cravings comes into play. And then there's also, emotional eating. So with the hormone changes that are happening during that time of month, maybe you're having big feelings coming up. Maybe your mental health might be struggling a little bit. And, sometimes we may turn to certain foods as a comfort or a coping mechanism. And that's something that I also like to normalize with my clients. The only caveat to that is obviously if like food is your only coping mechanism, that can be a huge issue. And, obviously like making sure we're taking care of our mental health and working with a provider is very important if you are struggling in that capacity. But just normalizing like emotional eating, taste hunger, all of that is so normal. And there's I guess the last component to that I would say is, yes, our bodies are going through so many changes, and actually like we're losing a lot of vitamins and minerals and all of that. So that could be our body telling us that we just need more food in general, or if maybe you are experiencing like very specific cravings, like whether it's chocolate or, sweet things. There's so many vitamins and minerals in chocolate that is, like I said, it could be our bodies just telling us that
I need this certain
we need to replenish this. So there's a lot that could be going on, at that time of month in terms of what we're craving, and like, our hunger might be elevated because our bodies are going through all these changes.
And needing more energy in order to do those hormonal things. Yeah,
exactly. Definitely higher energy needs. So yeah, it's a lot to navigate, but it's totally normal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I can imagine, I could see us having like 5 podcast episodes on this because there is so much to it and it is so countercultural. For people that would be interested in getting in touch with you and learning more or even scheduling a session with you, how can they get in contact with you?
Yeah. So probably the best way to contact me, honestly, is through my Instagram page. I'm very responsive on there. So that's going to be Harvesting Nutrition LLC. That's the handle on Instagram. You can message me there. I also have a website, harvestnutritionllc.com, where I have a contact me page. You can also learn about my services there. And then, I know most of the listeners might know you. So I know you can definitely put anyone in contact with
Absolutely.
me as well. But those are the 2 main ways, probably.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And I'm excited to keep talking about this with you in some later podcasts because I think this is something we really need and is often a big struggle for many of us.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for having me today. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, you guys, I hope you all have a good one. Thank you for tuning in.